It was a dark and stormy night. Or was it? Maybe it was a beautiful clear night like this one where I caught this amazing capture of the moon. When people think about ghost stories, mostly they go to haunted castles of Britain and Ireland. Rarely would people automatically think of ghost stories in Ontario. But thanks to authors like John Robert Colombo, who has Ghost Stories of Ontario, and Barbara Smith, Ontario Ghost Stories, there are some good stories to share from right here in Ontario and some locations that aren't that far from where I live. Now, on page 7, the author talks about the term poltergeist, and unlike some of the other definitions, which I've shared in previous videos, John Robert Colombo leaves it at the typical noisy spirit sounds. So as you go through his book, when the stories involve a poltergeist, that's what he's referring to. He also makes the important point that since we can't take a ghost or a spirit into a lab and study it, all we really have to go by are ghost stories and people sharing their own experiences in terms of trying to figure things out. On page 6, he makes the important point: when one thinks of Ontario in the 1990s, I would say in 2023 as well, ghosts do not immediately come to mind. He also mentions in his introduction, which I believe is important, that the stories he shared in this collection are all true ghost stories. He had people sign forms, and they're all first-person accounts. So they're not someone told me or I heard about. These are all stories about people's own experiences. Now, this particular book was published in 1995. So again, before the internet and everyone had email. So what he did was put ads in various newspapers, and people wrote letters into him responding to his questions. And I wanted to point that out because, again, it just gives you an idea of the different time period and why sometimes, particularly back then, it would take a while to gather up all the information, get back to people. If they gave you just an address, you had to write back to them, or a phone number you could call and connect with them. So it's not like today where you can just shoot out an email or make a comment on your video and then have people email you or direct message you. Another thing that has changed in the introduction, he mentions our population of 10 million people in Ontario. That was back in, again, the 1990s. Now in 2023, we're over 14 million people. So there's been a significant jump in population growth. He makes an interesting comment, something that I learned going through the introduction, which I didn't know before. Ontario is an unusual name. It means beautiful water in the language of the Iroquois. Found that to be very interesting, and we certainly do have a number of lakes and rivers here in the province. Another interesting point that comes up in the introduction was, of course, about the spiritualist movement. The stories in this particular book cover the years 1764 to the early 1990s, so quite a spread. The spiritualist movement was, of course, very popular throughout the end of the 1800s. So one of the stories that he shares are about some people who were closet spiritualists. And of course, back in that time, People didn't always come out to admit that they were involved in the movement, as did Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But other people who were affluent or involved in politics may have been involved with the spiritualist movement and had connections, but it wasn't something that they talked about, which is, of course, very different, again, like today, with social media and people thinking everything is their business. All of a sudden, information is out there all over social media, whether people want to share that or not. So, as the author mentions on page 15, referring to the spiritualist movement, in the 1850s in North America, it was as popular as New Age practices in the 1990s. Spiritualists practiced mediumship, New Agers practiced channeling. And I've mentioned some of the more popular channelers, such as Creon and Abraham Hicks. This is a collection of her works. So that's the difference between the spiritualists, but now rather than being called mediums, and we still have mediums, but there's another group of people who refer to themselves as channelers. Now, in that case, rather than contacting the deceased or ghosts or spirits, channelers typically refer to a connection with someone from one of the star systems, whether that's the Pleiades or Sirius or other groupings of stars or even other universes, I guess. The other point this author mentions is the change in terminology from psychical research to parapsychology. And he mentions that was in large part due to the research studies by J.B. Rhine at Duke University in the 1920s. It's a bit mind-boggling to think that was 100 years ago, and all these things are still so uncertain, and we're still unsure of what some of these things are. Rhine's studies focused on PK, or psychokinesis, literally mind over matter, and telepathy, because those were things that he could study and set up experiments for to assess how those abilities were working. The point, of course, as the author made earlier, because we can't bring a ghost or a spirit into a lab, what they could study was whether someone actually was using telepathy, whether mind over matter exists. In terms of experiments, another interesting thing that came up in the introduction, and I had forgotten about it until I read the book again last year, is something called the Philip phenomena. And I haven't actually come across that anywhere else, so I definitely want to look into this a bit more. Basically, what happened is a group of people decided to see what would happen if they just started acting like they were talking to a ghost. In other words, they didn't believe they were connecting with a ghost or a spirit, but they were pretending to be connecting with that ghost. So they gave him a name, they gave him a backstory, and then they started doing seances and table rapping. To their surprise, the ghost started changing their story. So it developed its own backstory and history. I found that fascinating because that's the complete opposite of what had happened in Hell House, the episode that I've mentioned from Supernatural a few times. Now, in the case of Hell House, the events there were unfolding because of the number of people who were focusing on a situation, all following one particular narrative, and in that case, that's how that ghost acted. The Philip phenomena is the complete opposite. The people had the story, generated it, knew it wasn't real, and suddenly this ghost or entity turned that story around. It wasn't behaving the way they had expected it to, or the way they thought that it should. That's part of what makes the paranormal such a challenge. It isn't just that there's different definitions to words and people aren't following the same definitions. Just when you think you've got an answer, you come up with another experience by people which is completely different. I'm not surprised that here we are 100 years later and no closer to actually coming up with an answer for what causes ghosts, what are ghosts, and all the other areas of the paranormal field, because it is such a challenge to get agreement on terms, locations, reasons. That comes to what is the purpose of reading ghost stories? The author sums it up beautifully. They give us an occasion to pause, to wonder about the imponderables around us: life, death, time, mortality, immortality, fate, and destiny. To that, I would also add, I would hope that it would open up conversations between people and coming up with different ideas and solutions. Like-minded people, to me, means people who can have a respectful, open conversation, and even if they don't agree on things, they can agree to disagree. The nice thing is that you can have that conversation and get some different ideas and share your opinions in a positive and respectful manner. So I agree, there is definitely a purpose to ghost stories, not just to get creeped out or enjoy a chill and a shiver, but it opens things up to so many other subjects and opportunities. Here is a book to thrill and chill you. It brings together 69 stories of haunted houses, ghosts, poltergeists, apparitions, and other eerie events and experiences. What's amazing is that all the stories are true. They actually happened, and they happened in the province of Ontario. Did Sir John A. Macdonald get advice from the dead? Did William Lyon Mackenzie King engage in a friendly conversation with a veteran newspaper at Kingsmere 2 years after his death? Is Ottawa's Laurier House haunted? What happened in Toronto's Mackenzie House? Did an apparition of Walt Whitman appear in Bon Echo Provincial Park? Does a beautiful lady in white haunt old stone houses in the North Woodstock area? What was behind the Baldoon mystery and the Dag poltergeist? Do such things happen? Are they happening today? In these pages, there are ghosts aplenty. They appear in the villages, towns, and cities of Ontario. Among them, Goderich, Hamilton, London, Toronto, Niagara-on-the-Lake, North Bay, Oakville, Oshawa, St. Catharines, and Sarnia. Perhaps there is a ghost near you. A few of the stories in this particular book are from the area where I live, either by an hour or two. And as you can see on this map of Ontario, that isn't surprising because the majority of the population is clustered within the southwestern area. One other point that I did want to make before I read two of the stories is that in the acknowledgments the author mentions there is a small but swelling literature that studies psychical research and parapsychology in Canada. There are a few groups here in Ontario, and I've found them on the internet, and I'll be talking more about one of them when I review another author, Kimberly Malto. And that again will likely be in 2023, around the same time when I cover Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum. If you're interested in learning more about that, be sure to click on that subscribe button down below and turn on the notification bell so you know when I upload content that may be of interest to you. The first story that I want to share from this book is titled Poltergeist in the Attic. Now keep in mind, as Mr. Colombo mentioned in the introduction, he thinks of a poltergeist as a noisy spirit. This story was sent in to him on June the 8th, 1990. Before I read the story, I also want to mention that when people asked to remain anonymous, the author did change the names and some of the locations just to keep things private, which I think is important and makes it more likely that people will share genuine information. In the case of this story, Poltergeist in the Attic, the woman who had lived in the home shared the story but didn't give some of the other information. And unfortunately, as so often with ghost stories of this type, we don't really know what happened to the building afterwards because, as she said in her letter to the author, she didn't want to say too much because there would be some people who were upset or disturbed by her comments regarding this particular house. The story that she shared: in the late 60s, we lived in an old farmhouse outside of London, Ontario. From the first week, we used to hear unusual sounds in the attic. So my husband and son went up with flashlights to check it out, but they found no holes and no signs of squirrels. The next evening, the sounds from the attic were frightening, as though giant birds were bouncing off the walls. This was odd, since one of the first things my husband did after we moved in was insulate the attic. Another trip up to the attic was to no avail. A few weeks later, around 3 a.m., we were awakened with the sounds of cupboard doors opening and closing. We all woke up except for our oldest son, who is a heavy sleeper. We put the lights on and went downstairs to check. Everything was fine. So in the story, we have things moving from the attic now to a different floor of the house. We had a German shepherd named Prince at the time. He slept on a mat by the kitchen door. He was terrified. His ears were flat to his head, and he never made a move or even barked. This was our watchdog. We never even locked a door while we had this dog. One day during the fall of the year, I was staining the old staircase. I decided to make a cup of tea and went downstairs. After one cup, I put the pot back on the stove and climbed up the stairs and continued with my work. About an hour later, I went back downstairs for another cup of tea, but couldn't find the teapot. I wasn't going to let it get the better of me, so I decided to have a glass of milk. When I reached for the milk, there was the teapot. After all these happenings, I talked to the man who had sold the house to us. He now lived across the road. I explained what had been going on, and he said the previous tenants had told him pretty well the same thing had happened to them. He said the only explanation he had was that an elderly sister and brother had lived in the house for years. This was when his parents had owned it, and they told him the brother and sister had a quarrel, and the sister told her brother she wouldn't speak to him for the rest of her life, and when her mother and father visited them, they spoke through them. Our daughter always had the feeling of a man's presence in the house. Many a day and night we'd hear heavy footsteps on the staircase and along the upstairs hall. The minute anyone went up to see what was making the noise, it would stop. I should mention our dog Prince always came upstairs at night to check us out. He visited our bedroom first. He'd touch our hands with his nose to let us know he was there, and then he went into the children's rooms. The night we heard the cupboard doors banging, he never moved. We were told animals are afraid of the unknown. With that, I don't agree about animals fearing the unknown. I think we have to consider that animals, whether it's cats, dogs, other animals, have senses different to ours. For example, dogs can hear a dog whistle, humans can't, so they're hearing things at a different frequency. Their eyesight is definitely much keener, as is their sense of smell. So it really is hard to say when there is something in the room, whether it's a mist, whether it's an energy, what are our pets actually experiencing? For myself, I know smell is a key factor because I can always tell the difference between when my grandmothers decide to pop by, because if it's my paternal grandmother, there's a strong smell of lily of the valley. If it's my maternal grandmother, there's that smell of orange blossoms, and that was the fragrances they both used when they were alive. And I get some people may think that's weird, may think it's my imagination, and that's okay. Again, I don't need validation from anyone else. I know when those smells arrive, and again, same as when I'm talking about animal guides, it has to do with what I'm thinking. Have I asked a question? Do I need a kick in the butt to get me on track with something? And one of them will typically show up with that fragrance, and I'll either find the information that I need or the information will come in another way. And that's just how my life goes. As I said in my previous video on George Newry, yes, I've been called weird all my life. I've been called some other things, and I'm okay with that because my life goes along tickety-boo and works for me. The other story that I wanted to share involves cats. Not just because I'm a cat lover, and if you've seen some of my other videos, you know sometimes either Panther or Tiki will make some guest appearances walking through. You may have seen Xena when I've done some of my reading videos. But this story also ties in with the events of a storm happening. And one theory, of course, is that when there are storms, you have all the negative ions, you have that buildup of energy. So is that what makes it possible for ghosts to appear? So this story contains several elements that I enjoy. A thunder and lightning storm. When I was a kid, my dad would always have to come outside and bring me in because I just love sitting out and watching it. It involves cats. Yes, I'm a cat lover. I also love dogs, but we've had cats for a number of years now. This particular story happened in 1989. We have two cats that seemed quite content with their new home. They would accompany me to bed, where I would read for an hour before going to sleep. One evening, while Peter was away in Toronto for a few days, I went to bed around 10 o'clock as usual to read. About 10:30, a storm erupted. Mild at first, and then grew in strength. I heard a low growl from Max the cat sitting beside me. When I looked up, his hair was standing up along his back. He was wild-eyed. I assumed it was the storm and looked over to the foot of the bed where Jenny, the other cat, had been curled up asleep. She was staring wide-eyed and had crouched back as far as she could in the corner of the bed. Suddenly I was aware of a large white Persian cat padding across the bed towards me, its tail straight up in welcome. My first reaction was, how the hell did the cat get in the house? I knew that I'd locked both doors, and there was no access through the windows. About arm's length distance, the cat disappeared. It looked as solid as one of my own cats. The storm dissipated, but the cats remained agitated, so I let them sleep with me for the night. A few months later, early spring, I was watching television. Max was curled up asleep on the Chesterfield across from me, and Jenny, likewise, beside me. The wind picked up and howled around the house. Suddenly, Max stood up, hair bristling, and stared towards the open door of the sitting room. Jenny whimpered and nestled as close and low as she could. Through the open door I could see on the small landing at the top of the stairs the white Persian cat. It trotted down the stairs, and as it stepped into the hallway, about 4 feet from where I was sitting, it disappeared. This last appearance has been repeated twice since then, the last about 2 weeks ago, when we had a really vicious storm. Unfortunately, Peter is yet to see the white Persian cat. I've done a little research on parapsychology. I'm convinced that the effect is a magnetic impression due to the possible magnetic lines running through our property. That was another reason I wanted to read this story. So this person is talking about not only her experience, but she presents a theory, she had done some research, and it also makes the important point of knowing about the history of the land where you live. You know, what was there before your home was built in that area? And it's something that I'm definitely planning on doing with my location. And I'll be talking a lot more about that when I discuss earth acupuncture as it relates to, again, the importance of knowing what's gone on with your land and how you can make some tweaks or at least understand why different things are going on. In this case, she's talking about magnetic lines. She may be making reference to what other people call Lee lines, and that again ties in with ancient artifacts, ancient buildings. And I keep coming back to this, but so many things interconnect. Whether you're reading about ghost stories, ancient civilizations, there are so many different connections about things. It's why I encourage people to read a wide range of subjects. If you're only reading one thing, you're not really broadening or expanding your understanding or your knowledge base. I can't think of the number of times that I have read one book on a subject and yet it related to something in another subject which either made the subject easier to understand for me or made me aware that maybe you need to rethink some of the other things that you've been reading. This story finishes with, I've inquired in the neighborhood if any previous owners had a white Persian cat. No one remembers anything. If it had only been my own impression, I would have said I was hallucinating. But the cat certainly did react to something. So again, that ties in with, what were the cats seeing? What were they hearing? As I said, if you enjoy reading ghost stories, John Robert Colombo is an author that I would definitely recommend. I enjoyed reading Ghost Stories of Ontario, and I've read a number of his other books as well, so be sure to check him out. The other author that I want to talk about is Barbara Smith, Ontario Ghost Stories. This was published in 1998 by Lone Pine Publishing. As you can see, she also has a number of different stories. In her introduction, Barbara mentions that she was born and raised in Ontario, and this is her fourth book of true Canadian ghost stories. Like John Robert Colombo, she had put out requests for people to send their stories into her. It's interesting to note that she says, defining the term ghost would seem like a sensible place to start trying to solve the mystery. Searching out that definition has become something of a mission for over the past 10 years. She goes on to say that, like many of us who are interested in this field and trying to understand different things, why do some people see ghosts or feel ghosts and other people nothing? Why do ghosts stay behind? How many ghosts would stay behind? Why are some places haunted and other places that may have had some equally horrific events occurring have nothing? That's what makes all of this so difficult to try and figure out and understand. And no, I don't think that it's just in everybody's head. There have been far too many experiences from a wide range of people. Yes, some hoaxers. Yes, some who needed to get help for some other issues. But that isn't everyone who has reported different stories and events that have happened. So there has to be something to it. The author goes on to mention Frederick Myers, and he will come up again in Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum, as he was one of the original founding members of the Society for Psychical Research in London, England. According to Mr. Myers, he suggested that a ghost is an indication that some kind of force is being exercised after death. This force is in some way connected with a person now deceased. He further suggested that ghosts are unaware of themselves and incapable of thought. Now, when I read that, I thought of the movie The Others with Nicole Kidman. And I'm not going to give any spoilers, but if you've seen the movie, you know the ghosts were very much aware of themselves, of where they were, and things happening around them. So I don't agree with Mr. Myers that ghosts are unaware. I think they have, whether it's a different dimension, a different perspective, I believe that there is definitely something more to it than just the energy that leaves us when we die kind of floating around. On page 10, this author also talks about poltergeist, but her explanation is very different from John Robert Colombo. She says, a poltergeist is a rare type of spectral being that can be identified by its noisy and possibly violent behaviors. It will often move objects and can actually wreak havoc on its surrounding physical environment. Poltergeists are associated with people rather than places. They've been known to follow people for years, even through a succession of moves. I've mentioned that when I did my paranormal definition section in the videos earlier. I've mentioned that when I talked about poltergeists and the paranormal. I personally believe this one fits more with poltergeist rather than just this noisy spirit that most people seem to think that it is. Personally, I think that situation is entirely different than a poltergeist situation. Someday I might explain why and why I also agree with the poltergeist isn't about the place, it's about the person, and it will show up in other locations. Different stories that I have read about poltergeist, it isn't just something that happens in the person's home, it will follow them everywhere, whether they're with other people, out socializing, whether they're at work. If it's a poltergeist, those events are happening in more than one location. And again, this goes back to the challenge of. So if you're watching paranormal investigators who believe a poltergeist is simply a noisy spirit, you'll see the word poltergeist in some of their video descriptions. And I have yet to see a single paranormal investigator actually hitting on the fact that it involves psychokinesis. Mostly what I have seen are investigators who believe it's a noisy spirit, so they hear a bump or something wherever they are, and suddenly you have a poltergeist in the building, which I personally don't believe. I go with, as I said, the definition that it involves psychokinesis, and I have my own reasons and my own experiences for believing that. And as the author says, a paranormal encounter is a profoundly moving experience. It always surprises me when I hear people saying, "Oh, I'd really love to see a ghost," or "I'd really love to have this type of experience." My thought is, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't. Because for those of us who have had a variety of different experiences over most of our lives, I can assure you, if that's happened to you, one, you get labeled a whole lot of names that don't really fit, don't belong. People get freaked out. People don't always believe what you've experienced. Now, granted, for some of these people, they have a phone permanently attached to their hand, or they've got cameras, what have you. Maybe they'll capture it. And some of them are, of course, looking for extra clicks and views. So, of course, they want to catch something legit. But for the average person who really isn't trying to get known for this type of activity, most people tend to stay silent about it. And even though it's 2023, there's still a lot of people who stay silent about it because we're not all like that dingleberry in England who thinks he's talking to Vlad. I'm sorry, but some very gullible, naive people who are sending him money and feeling bad for him. Give me a break, snap a few neurons, and do a bit of research. And you shouldn't need the debunkers to tell you how fake that clown is. On page 12, the author talks about an issue that I've seen commented on by the World of Mr. Gray, as well as some other channels and live chats that I've been in. Why are ghosts always wearing modern day clothes, and why are they always modern? Why don't people see ghosts of dinosaurs or cavemen? Humans have been around for a long time. Should be ghosts all over the place. This sums it up quite well. I presume that, like all forms of energy, ghosts eventually weaken to the point of virtual dissipation. When we were talking about broadcasts and they're still bouncing around up in the atmosphere, and they will be for years to come, and eventually they begin to dissipate and fade. So it's quite possible, like this author, and there may be something to that. Do ghosts or spirits eventually begin over time to fade and disappear, as Albert Einstein, Dr. Stephen Hawking, and others have said? Energy never completely disappears. It changes shape, it may change form, but it never completely disappears. Richard Palmisano talked about clusters, and so the newest person to pass away joins this cluster of previous energies and spirits. So maybe that's the one who comes forward when people are asking for information or contact, because they're the one most aware of what's going on at that time. So there's a lot of different theories out there for sure. The author also explains about why ghost stories never seem to have any kind of a conclusive ending, or they rarely do. Because, as she says, a fictional account of a haunting will be structured with predictable presentation. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. True ghost stories don't always work that way. Sometimes people have moved, they've lost track of the location, or they're not in contact with people who now live at the new location. Sometimes it's just a glimpse, or they're on holidays somewhere. So there isn't always that nice, neat way to wrap everything up at the end of a true ghost story. On the back of the book, Ontario's colorful history has given rise to spine-tingling, blood-curdling tales that will have you checking under the bed, behind closet doors, and in the basement. The stories range from long-dead relatives returning for a last look at a loved one, to loud footsteps, flashing lights, and crashing noises in the unoccupied upstairs of that old house down the road. Ontario Ghost Stories. Spooky stories come from all over Ontario, including Timmins, Prescott, Gananoque, Mississauga, Gravenhurst, Almont, Kleinburg, Perth, Cross Hill, Ottawa, Whitby, Kingston, Haliburton, Smiths Falls, Kitchener, St. Catharines, Brockville, Bracebridge, Windsor, Brantford, Burlington, and more. So a few different places than John Robert Colombo mentioned. Watson's Mill in Manotick, and a gangster hideout near Muskoka. Herds of phantom beasts protecting buried treasure near Ajax. Tom Thompson on his final canoe ride in Algonquin Park. And Tom Thompson was one of the group of 7. Ghost ships on the Great Lakes. Apparitions from the War of 1812 at Fort George and at the Angel Inn in Niagara-on-the-Lake, the Grand Theatre in London, Dundurn Castle and Custom House in Hamilton, the farm of the murdered Donnellys near Lucan, Baldoon, the cursed settlement near Wallaceburg, Toronto's Winter Garden Theatre, Royal Alexandra Theatre, Queen's Park, the Grange, Canada's Hockey Hall of Fame, Old City Hall, Mackenzie House, and the former Massey Mansion. Maybe the ghosts and spirits at Queen's Park could give some of our politicians a little kick in the katukas and on the right track. Just putting it out there if there's ghosts there. Murder and tragedy are woven together with mystery and misfortune in this chilling collection of tales of the paranormal. The 2 stories that I want to share from her book One is about the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank on November the 10th, 1975. I was 11 years old at the time, and I remember as that story unfolded. And again, we didn't have social media. It took a while before all the information came out, and that information came either on the TV as news reports or we heard it on the radio. We didn't have home computers, we didn't have cell phones, and I really cannot tell you how grateful I am that I grew up in a time without any of those things. That's just me. It isn't that we didn't have issues or problems at that time, but we certainly weren't as inundated, constantly having stuff thrown at us 24/7, literally. I mean, I remember the TV actually went off at a certain hour. It wasn't 24/7 like it is now. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald was very heartbreaking and certainly a tragedy. A phantom ship, sometimes called a Flying Dutchman in reference to one of the oldest ghost ships, is an apparition of a sailing craft that has met a tragic end. The most frequently told version of the original Flying Dutchman legend involves a foolishly stubborn sea captain who insisted on continuing to sail around the Cape of Good Hope during a severe storm. The ship, her captain, and her crew were all lost as a result of the man's perilous decision, and so his soul has been doomed to sail the ill-fated vessel into eternity. Sightings of her image have been reported over the years. Phantom ships are often seen during storms and are almost always associated with tragedy. So again, we have that element of a storm. Is it the ions? Is it something about the energy and the power that comes with the storm? Again, it's related to not just sightings on land, but sightings over the waterways. According to the lyrics in one of Gordon Lightfoot's songs, the watery depths of Lake Superior can be tragically possessive. And I remember hearing that song, and Gordon Lightfoot is a Canadian musician. Of course, the musician didn't create that theory. Native tribes have been respectful of the lake's lethal grasp for generations. Lightfoot merely sang about the apparent hex in his tribute to the men lost when the Edmund Fitzgerald sank on November the 10th, 1975. Throughout the history and geography of shipping on the enormous and unpredictable body of water that is Lake Superior, there have been accounts of vessels vanishing without a trace. Many of those vanished ships, including the Edmund Fitzgerald, have been sighted hours, weeks, years, and even centuries after their demise. Sighted as a phantom, that is. The Edmund Fitzgerald certainly fits into these expected categories. Her sudden sinking has been studied by experts in the field of naval investigation. As she was within visual range of other ships, it is known that the Edmund Fitzgerald, an enormous ore carrier, sank completely beneath the surface of the water and therefore from view in less than 2 minutes. That short a time would seem to defy accepted laws of physics, and yet that is exactly what happened. In this case, the Edmund Fitzgerald was on Lake Superior, and according to this, it only took 2 minutes to sink, which makes it understandable that sadly, none of the crew had a chance to actually get away or be rescued. It's now reasoned that although the Edmund Fitzgerald's captain knew his ship had been damaged in the Lake Superior storm, he did not appreciate the extent or seriousness of that damage. If he had, surely he would have radioed for assistance. The facts that remain tell us that he did not, and mere seconds after a sailor on the nearby Anderson noted his position relative to the Fitzgeralds, the largest ship ever to ply the Great Lakes simply disappeared from sight. All hands were lost. For years no physical trace of the ship was seen again. Her soul, however, continues to buffet her way through the waves. As a phantom ship, one of the most modern additions to the legions of ghost ships in Ontario. I wanted to share that story because, one, I remember the Edmund Fitzgerald, and like I say, as that story unfolded, Gordon Lightfoot wrote a beautiful tribute to all the people that were lost on that ship. And until I read this story, I had no idea that it was 2 minutes. That's not very long. Even if the captain had sent out a distress signal, it's hard to say whether anyone could have been rescued. And I'll also be looking into other Ontario ghost ships because I've known of a few, but not very many. The other story I want to share is about the treasure and phantom beasts. The tremendous hormonal surges that youngsters go through during puberty has been known to make some teenagers extremely receptive to paranormal activity happening around them, which they otherwise might not have noticed. It's fitting, then, that this age group also has an unusually high incidence of interest in the field. Generally speaking, young people love to read and tell ghost stories, to see horror films, and to go to spooky places. Of course, part of the reason for their attraction to such pursuits is simply that their parents likely will not approve. Therefore, they enter into many of these ventures independent of, and even in defiance of, parental control. When I was in high school, we used to party in the woods north of Ajax in an area known as Salem's Lot, Robert began, before pointing out the connection between the name given to the site and the title of one of Stephen King's spooky novels. There were many stories associated with the place, he continued. Predictably, these stories either fell into the grisly category or the scary category, or both. Equally predictably, not all of the teenagers believed all of the tales, Robert included, until his experience in the early 1990s. I'd been telling a friend of mine about these stories I'd heard in high school. We drove up to the place where the old road used to take us into the spot. Within the 5 or 6 years since I'd last been there, that road had disappeared. Only slightly unnerved, the pair decided to continue their exploration. We parked the car and proceeded to walk through the woods. We found a path that led between 2 trees with arcane symbols painted on them. We followed the path through the trees and kept walking. As they came to an area adjacent to a farmer's field, the 2 young men decided they were not above a little black humor of their own. They began to carve a symbol of the Necronomicon, a name coined by occult author H.P. Lovecraft, into the ground, and chuckled as they thought of their mischief frightening future generations of daredevil youngsters. Little did they suspect that their carvings would soon make them the terrified brunt of a supernatural ploy. Jay and Robert hadn't dug too far into the soil when they discovered that it was concealing a bed of asphalt. By now they were completely captivated. They decided to dig down below the paving material in the hope of revealing whatever it might be hiding. The work went slow and was accompanied by the persistent barking of what sounded like a large dog. Robert later explained that at first it seemed as though the obviously angry animal was roughly a mile away, somewhere in the farmer's field. As they continued to dig, the sounds became louder and more frightening, yet no trace of any animal could be seen. Within about 15 seconds, the sound grew from sounding like one dog to a pack, tearing something apart that just refused to die. It was getting closer. Within another 1 to 15 seconds, what sounded like it was a mile away sounded like it was 50 feet away, coming through the cornfield, howling, screaming, and snarling. It was about 15 feet from us. The noise was deafening. I turned to Jay, and he bolted down the path. I followed. It was dark by then, so we were tripping and falling over branches and undergrowth, but we still ran in complete panic. These were not young men who scared easily. Robert described his friend Jay as being the smaller of the two, at 6 foot 1 inch in height and 180 pounds. Normally we aren't scared of anything, but that night we ran like the hounds of hell were after us. Once the pair was safely out of the woods in Robert's car and driving away, they realized that the asphalt they'd been digging had once been the road that the high school students had taken into the woods, that Robert had been looking for when he returned with his friend Jay. I have no idea who went to such effort to ensure it wouldn't be driven down again. Had the person responsible for burying the road known that there were also vicious-sounding animal spirits protecting whatever was being hidden, then perhaps he might have saved himself some work. Robert closed his story with a cryptic comment that this story was only one of the many ghost stories from Salem's Lot, north of Ajax. A lot of interesting elements there. So we have the talk about teens being either open or receptive to the paranormal. We have the creepy woods and a road that's gone missing. We have the element of the dogs and what was it about, was it something to do with the symbol that they'd drawn on the ground? What were the dogs protecting and why would they have appeared? They sounded like they were far away, so they didn't just materialize at whatever was going on in this location. There's a lot of interesting elements to the story. Unlike John Robert Colombo, Barbara finishes her book with a list of further reading. Now, here's a fascinating connection. When I was talking about John Robert Colombo's book, I mentioned the Philip experiment. One of the suggested readings that Barbara has in her book is Conjuring Up Philip, an Adventure in Psychokinesis. That's written by Iris Owen and Margaret Sparrow. It was published in 1976. And that was published by Fitzhenry and Whiteside. So again, there's another connection between those two books. If you enjoy reading ghost stories, I suggest Ontario Ghost Stories by Barbara Smith. If you've enjoyed this video and found it to be of interest or benefit, be sure to click that like button down below, as that helps my channel get out to other viewers as well. Be sure to leave me a comment. Did you know that there were so many ghosts in Ontario? It really is an interesting area, it would be neat to get out to some of these locations and see what, if anything, decided to show up at the time. Who knows, maybe one of these days I'll actually be able to get out and do a little investigating of my own. Until next time, happy reading.